Boston was hit by a wave of molasses. That sounds like a punchline. It is not. It sounds like someone lost a bet while inventing the dumbest possible disaster headline. Boston did not get that lucky. On January 15, 1919, a steel tank near Commercial Street in Boston's North End split open and released more than 2 million gallons of molasses into a working neighborhood. It did not trickle out. It did not make a mess and stop. It moved through the street like a dark wall. People were walking through an ordinary Wednesday. Workers were near the waterfront. Horses stood in the street. A firehouse sat nearby. Elevated rail supports, wagons, shops, and homes were packed around the tank like the tank had always belonged there. Then the tank failed. Molasses became a fast, heavy force. Buildings broke. Horses were trapped. People were swept off their feet. Rescue workers had to pull victims from something that clung to everything it touched. 21 people died. Roughly 150 were injured. And the strangest part is not that molasses can kill. With enough weight behind it, almost anything can kill. The strangest part is how ordinary the warning signs were before the wall came down. Because apparently, if the giant metal tank full of industrial syrup starts leaking and growling at the neighborhood, the correct answer is not, maybe stop. The tank belonged to Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of United States Industrial Alcohol. Its contents were part of an industrial chain, not a kitchen story. Molasses could be fermented into alcohol, and industrial alcohol mattered to manufacturing, liquor, and wartime production. So in 1915, during a period when demand was high, a massive storage tank went up on the Boston waterfront. The tank was about 50 feet tall and about 90 feet across. It could hold millions of gallons. In the North End, that made it more than equipment. It became a landmark with pressure inside it. If you lived nearby, you did not have to imagine the danger. You walked past it. That is the first trap in this story. Familiarity can make a hazard feel permanent. The tank leaked almost from the beginning. Molasses seeped out through seams and rivets. Children reportedly collected the drippings. People saw the stains. The structure made groaning sounds when it was full. Those details matter because they are not dramatic after the fact. They are small. A leak. A sound. A strange brown stain on the side of an industrial tank. The kind of thing a company can explain away. The kind of thing a neighborhood can get used to. The kind of thing that only looks obvious once 21 people are dead. There is an especially ugly detail in some accounts. The tank was painted a dark brown color, close enough to the color of molasses to make the leaks less visible. If you want one image that explains the whole disaster before it happens, that might be it. Not the wave. The paint. A company has a tank that leaks. Instead of treating the leak as a public warning, the warning becomes something to manage, something to cover, something to fold into normal business. That is how a disaster gets a head start. It does not always begin with a loud crack. Sometimes it begins with a stain nobody wants to keep looking at. The paint is the whole corporate safety meeting in one image. Problem solved, as long as nobody asks whether the wall is still failing behind the fresh coat. The public version of the Great Molasses Flood usually begins with the wave. That is understandable. The wave is impossible to forget. But the real story starts earlier, when a giant tank was allowed to behave like a warning sign and still remain in service. Accounts later focused on the tank's construction and oversight. Arthur Gell, connected to United States Industrial Alcohol and the Tank Project, was not the kind of qualified engineer you want as the final line of defense for a structure holding millions of gallons. The tank was not treated with the caution its size demanded. That is not colorful trivia. That is the mechanism. The disaster did not need magic. It needed pressure, mass, weak construction, and enough confidence to ignore the sound of metal complaining. This also explains why the molasses itself is the wrong villain. The molasses was not evil. It was not mysterious. It was an industrial material being stored at an absurd scale in a place full of ordinary life. The danger came from the mismatch. Molasses in a jar is breakfast adjacent. Molasses in a 5-story industrial tank is a physics problem wearing a dessert name tag. Kitchens are built for small amounts. Streets are built for pedestrians, horses, carts, trucks, rails, and people trying to get through a day. Neighborhoods are built around habits. A tank like that brought industrial mass into the middle of those habits. Once it failed, everything ordinary became part of the path. A street became a channel. Buildings became impact points. Rail supports became obstacles. People became trapped in a system they never chose to enter. By January 1919, the tank had been filled again. Molasses arrived by ship and went into the container near Commercial Street. Boston was in winter, but the days around the disaster brought a sharp temperature change. Cold molasses is thick. Warmer molasses can move differently. Pressure inside a full tank can shift with conditions. The exact physics can get complicated, but the human meaning is simple. A giant container already suspected of weakness was holding an enormous amount of dense liquid in a crowded place. Think about what that means in physical terms. This was not a barrel tipping over. It was not a broken pipe. It was millions of gallons of dense liquid suddenly released from height and containment. The tank had been holding back weight, not just volume. When the wall gave way, the molasses did not ask anyone to believe in the story. It proved itself by moving. At about 12:30 in the afternoon, people heard the failure. Some described a cracking sound. Some heard a deep roar. There were sharp reports as metal gave way. Then the side of the tank opened and the molasses came out. This is where the mind tries to slow the image down because of the word itself. Molasses. Slow as molasses. That phrase is useless here. This was not slow as molasses. This was molasses with a running start and a bad attitude from gravity. A spoonful of molasses is slow. A jar of molasses is slow. More than 2 million gallons released at once is not a spoonful. It is mass with direction. Reports described a wave racing through the north end at terrifying speed. Some accounts put it near 35 miles per hour. Descriptions of its height vary, but nobody needed a ruler to know what happened. It was high enough and heavy enough to tear through the street. The wave struck buildings and pushed debris ahead of it. It damaged rail supports. It smashed vehicles and wagons. It hit people before many of them could understand what they were seeing. Near the tank, children were caught in the rush. Among the victims were Maria Di Stasio and Pasquale Iantosca, both about 10 years old, whose names pull the story out of the category of weird fact and back into a neighborhood. This was not just Boston getting flooded by syrup. It was a child outside on a winter day. It was a worker at the wrong distance from the tank. It was a horse unable to pull free. It was a firefighter entering a disaster where the ground grabbed back. The absurdity gets you in the door. The names make you sit down. The first wave was violent. The aftermath was worse in a different way. Molasses does not behave like water after it spreads. It sticks. It coats. It traps. It gets heavier as the scene gets colder. Rescue workers were not just climbing over wreckage. They were moving through a substance that fought every step. People were pinned under debris. People were buried in the dark mass. Some victims could not breathe. Some were carried into areas rescuers could barely reach. Reports from the days after the flood describe families waiting for names, bodies being recovered slowly, and the death toll becoming clear only as the mess gave up what it had taken. That is why the event should never be told as a quirky disaster. The absurd image is the hook. The rescue is the truth. Police, firefighters, sailors, workers, and neighbors joined the response. They had to improvise because nobody had a clean method for clearing a city street drowned in molasses. Salt water helped cut through it. Sand helped absorb it. Crews washed and scraped and hauled, but the substance kept spreading through contact. The people on the ground did not get to experience the event as a historical anecdote. They got seconds. One moment, Commercial Street was a working waterfront street. The next, there was a wave, wreckage, shouting, animals screaming, and people trying to move through a substance that made movement nearly impossible. Some victims were close to the tank. Some were caught as the wave pushed outward. Some were buried under debris and molasses together. The mess made every rescue decision harder because a rescuer could become trapped while trying to reach someone else. That is what makes the disaster so different from the silly version of the story. The substance was strange, but the fear was not. The fear was being unable to stand. The fear was being unable to breathe. The fear was hearing someone nearby and not being able to reach them fast enough. People tracked it through the city, onto tools, onto floors, onto streetcars, onto telephones, into places far beyond the first impact. The immediate cleanup took weeks. The memory lasted longer. Boston residents later repeated the detail that the neighborhood smelled like molasses for years. That may be the most disturbing sensory detail in the case. Smell is not a statistic. It does not sit politely in a report. It returns when the air changes. It turns an event into something the body remembers before the mind does. There is also a practical reason the smell matters. The cleanup spread the disaster beyond the first wave. Workers tracked molasses away from the site. Equipment carried it. Shoes carried it. Vehicles and streetcars carried traces of it into the rest of the city. The flood was local, but the residue kept traveling. That is a different kind of aftermath. No flames. No smoke column. No single collapsed building that could be fenced off and forgotten. Instead, a sticky reminder followed people home. If the story ended there, it would still be unforgettable. But the courtroom is what turns it from a bizarre tragedy into a warning. United States Industrial Alcohol did not simply accept blame. The company argued sabotage. In 1919, that claim was not pulled out of nowhere. Fear of anarchist violence was real in the United States. Bombings and threats had occurred. Industrial facilities connected to wartime production had reason to fear attack. So the company had a story. Maybe someone blew up the tank. Maybe the company had been targeted. Maybe this was not negligence. It is a very convenient plot twist when the dangerous thing you own explodes and your first suspect is mysterious enemies, not the dangerous thing we own. That defense gave the case its central contradiction. Was Boston looking at a random act of violence, or was it looking at a preventable industrial failure? The answer mattered because the molasses was already strange enough. If the company could keep the focus on sabotage, the leaks and groaning metal might stay in the background. If investigators and lawyers could force the focus back onto the tank, the disaster would become harder to dismiss as bad luck. The lawsuits stretched for years. More than 100 claims were brought. Witnesses, engineers, company records, construction details, and physical evidence all had to be pulled into one long argument. This is one of the strongest parts of the story because the company defense had to compete against the neighborhood's memory. People had seen the tank leak. People had heard it groan. People knew it had been treated like a normal part of the waterfront even when it was behaving like a problem. That made the courtroom more than paperwork. It became a place where the disaster had to be reconstructed from small warnings that had been easy to ignore one at a time. One leak might be dismissed. One noise might be dismissed. One complaint might be dismissed. One rush decision might be dismissed. But put them together after the tank ruptures, and the story changes. The courtroom version of the story is slower than the flood, but it is just as important. Because a wave can kill people. A court record can prove why they died. State Auditor Hugh W. Ogden eventually ruled against United States Industrial Alcohol. The finding did not turn the flood into mystery. It turned it into responsibility. The tank was found to be unsound, and the company was ordered to pay damages. That ruling changed the story's afterlife. Without it, the Great Molasses Flood might have remained mostly a strange local memory. With it, the disaster became part of a larger shift toward engineering accountability, construction oversight, and the idea that a company cannot simply put a massive structure in a neighborhood and hope confidence counts as safety. That is the serious legacy hiding under the ridiculous headline. The legal aftermath also gives the episode its real ending. The flood itself lasted minutes. The cleanup lasted weeks. The smell lasted in memory for years. But the argument over responsibility dragged on long enough to change what the disaster meant. It was no longer only a neighborhood tragedy. It became a case about what companies owe the people who live around their infrastructure. That is why the tank is the central object, not the molasses. The molasses made the disaster unforgettable. The tank made it explainable. Modern engineering analysis has only sharpened the point. Structural engineer Ronald Mayville later studied the failure using modern tools and argued that the tank's steel was too thin for the load, with problems around rivets and stress. Other accounts have pointed to the lack of proper testing and inadequate professional oversight. You do not need to be an engineer to feel the meaning. The tank was asked to hold more than it could safely hold. The neighborhood paid for that mistake. Mayville's later analysis made the failure feel less like an old mystery and more like an old math problem. Steel thickness, rivets, stress, brittle fracture, and repeated loading are not dramatic words. But they are the kind of words that decide whether a wall holds or opens. That is the brutal thing about engineering failures. They often look boring before they look catastrophic. Measurements, loads, inspections, design assumptions, material choices, professional review. If those pieces are treated as paperwork instead of protection, the public may only learn their importance when the structure stops forgiving everyone. This is the reason the Great Molasses Flood is a perfect, insane, true story. It has the impossible sentence up front, but every step after that makes the impossible sentence more real. First, Boston was hit by molasses. Then, it was not a small spill, it was more than 2 million gallons. Then, the tank was taller than nearby buildings. Then, it had leaked and grown before. Then, the wave moved fast enough to outrun people. Then, children, workers, horses, firefighters, and pedestrians were caught in it. Then, the company blamed sabotage. Then, the legal record pointed back to the tank. That is the lane right there. Every time the story sounds too ridiculous to be real, the next fact makes it worse. The escalation does not come from making the story bigger than it was. It comes from refusing to shrink it into trivia. The physical force matters. The victims matter. The industrial choices matter. The courtroom matters. The final lesson matters. The title makes it sound like a city was killed by syrup. The record shows a dense neighborhood struck by a badly trusted industrial container. That difference is everything. Because syrup kills city is a weird headline. A leaking tank full of industrial molasses was left beside a crowded street until it burst is a warning. And the warning is not soft. The warning is that danger does not always announce itself with flames, alarms, or obvious violence. Sometimes it seeps. Sometimes it stains. Sometimes it makes noises. Sometimes people complain. Sometimes the people responsible decide the object is still useful enough to keep using. Then one day, the warning stops being a warning. It becomes the event. When people say the Great Molasses Flood sounds fake, they are right to feel that way at first. The human brain is not built to immediately picture molasses moving like a destructive wave through a city street. But that disbelief is the doorway, not the destination. Once you step through it, the story becomes painfully concrete. Commercial Street, January 15, 1919. A waterfront tank. Purity Distilling. United States Industrial Alcohol. Millions of gallons. Leaks. Groaning metal. A rupture at lunchtime. A wave through the north end. 21 dead. Roughly 150 injured. Years of lawsuits. A ruling against the company. A disaster remembered by the smell it left behind. That is not folklore. That is a chain. And chains are harder to laugh at than legends because every link asks the same question. Who had a chance to break this before it reached the street? The answer is not one person, one bolt, or one warm afternoon. It is the whole sequence. The tank went up. The tank leaked. The tank remained. The tank filled. The pressure built. The metal failed. The neighborhood took the force. The company denied the obvious. The record pulled it back. That is why the final image should not be a cartoon wave of syrup. It should be a street after the wave has passed. Gourds broken, shoes stuck, horses down, firefighters covered in molasses, families waiting, workers washing a city that will not come clean quickly, and above all of it, the absurd smell of sweetness attached to grief. The Great Molasses Flood begins as one of the strangest true sentences in American history. Boston was hit by a wave of molasses. But it ends somewhere much harder. How long can a warning sit in public view before people stop seeing it? People did not die because molasses is funny. They died because a dangerous thing was allowed to look ordinary for too long.